Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our COVID-19 webinar series. I'm Kristen Uhlenbrock. I work at the Institute for Science and Policy, a project of the Denver Museum of Nature and Science. And together with our partners at the Colorado School of Public Health, we are really excited to have been bringing you this COVID-19 webinar series since early 2020. Thank you for joining today. I think you heard Nicole say, open that chat, let us know where you're watching from. That's going to be where you're going to drop in any questions or thoughts you have throughout today's episode. If you have missed any of our past episodes, we do have video recordings and written transcripts. Those are available on the Institute website. Just go there and you can check them out. That's institute.dmns.org. So we are about a year out from when COVID-19 had really started to shut our doors to normal operations, both for many businesses and activities, as well as really importantly, a moment in time when kids started being sent home from school and COVID-19 really started to impact our education system. So from K-12 to colleges and universities, our students, our teachers and faculty, our staff, our families, our communities have really had to reimagine what does education look like during a pandemic when we are trying to keep everyone safe. So today we're going to be tackling that big complex operation that is our education system. And our guests come from various different backgrounds. And so we're going to be hearing a broad range of experiences on the challenges, the lessons, and the solutions that this pandemic has brought to our education system and how our outlook is going to look for the road ahead as we try to get back, quote unquote, to a new normal or whatever normal looks like. So today's episode 28 as part of this COVID-19 series. Yes, we've done 28 so far. And this is actually episode 2 as part of a 3-part mini series within that where we've been talking about the road to new normal. In our next episode of the 3rd part of the mini series, we're going to be focusing on the future of business and culture, and that will be in 2 weeks. So I want to bring our guests into this conversation and introduce them real briefly here. First up, we have Rebecca Holmes. She is the president and CEO of the Colorado Education Initiative. She began her education career as a teacher in Denver's Cole neighborhood and is a proud alumna of Colorado's public schools. Previously, she was the Associate Commissioner for Innovation, Choice, and Engagement at the Colorado Department of Education. Good morning, Rebecca. How are you today?
Good morning, Kristen. It's great to be here with you and thinking about the future for Colorado's nearly million K-12 students.
Great. We're so glad to have you. Also joining us today is Christie Imholt. She is the Director of District Policy for Aurora Public Schools, where she serves as a key advisor to the Superintendent on accelerating progress towards the district's goals and objectives to meeting the learning needs of all students. Prior to joining APS in 2017, she spent a career in a range of education and policy roles, including teaching high school social studies, as well as working at the U.S. Department of Education, the White House Office of Management Budget, and in the Denver public school system. It's nice to have you here this morning, Christie. How are you?
I'm good, Kristen. It's great to be here, and I'm really excited to talk with you and Rebecca and Landon about the future of education.
Great to have you. And our 3rd guest is Landon Pirius, who serves as a Vice Chancellor for Academic and Student Affairs for the Colorado Community College System. In his role as Provost for CCCS, he provides a strategic leadership related to all aspects of academic affairs, student affairs, and online education, as well as leads diversity, equity, and inclusivity initiatives. Prior to moving to Colorado, Landon was the Vice President for Academic and Student Affairs at North Hennepin Community College in Minnesota. Good morning, Landon. How are you?
Yeah, good morning, and thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Great. We're glad to have all 3 of you. So just as our audience aware, this is going to be a full discussion for the next 45 minutes or so. So we want to hear your questions and we'll try to work them in as we go along. But I want to start with just an opener for all 3 of my guests to just tackle. Today's March 10th, 2021. Many of us are thinking about kind of a year ago and where we've come, but I want you to be very much in the moment. And you woke up probably not too long ago because it is only 8:30 here Mountain Time. And I want to say, when you wake up on a day like today, what is one of those 1 or 2 most pressing issues that you're currently thinking about as it relates to education and through the lens of how you work? And I'm going to start with, how about we go with the order I introduced you? So Rebecca, Christie, and Landon, why don't you just give us a few of your thoughts here?
Sure. Well, you're looking at a group of people here who think about education all day long, so we probably don't think about things that normal to other people, because it's a pretty all-encompassing body of work to do. You know, I'm really thinking about the fact that at CEI, we have one foot in the current state in improvement efforts in education. We work in about 54 districts across Colorado, and another foot in the innovation space. We were founded in many ways to be the R&D arm to Colorado's education system. And in our innovation space, we had folks last year calling from all over the country saying, no one ever wanted the pandemic. No one ever wanted this kind of disruption to schools or trauma for families and kids. But we were waiting and sort of desiring a demand creating event for innovation in education, that there'd been good ideas that didn't often take hold because of a number of features of our education system, including our own collective memory about, well, it worked for me, or it worked for us, or it's always been this way. And so, you know, folks who called all last year saying, this is the innovative moment we've always wanted, we think we're actually a little out of step with folks like Christie, who have the big job of actually running a pre-K through 12 school district day to day. Last year was the year for emergency response, for sort of, you know, duct taping the thing back together and pivoting on a dime. This coming school year is where we really have an opportunity to rethink all the things we've done for a century in education, and respond differently, to interrogate everything from grading policies to seat time. And it's hard to make space to do that, but that's really where I'm drawing excitement and inspiration about 2021.
That's great. It's interesting, Rebecca, actually, we're, I think, in some ways operating in that same space, right? We both have, as a school district, waking up this morning, it's, okay, what are the immediate things? We've got, you know, another few months of school left. How do we make the most of it? How do we make sure we're maximizing student in-person learning and maximizing that impact for our students? And so it is really the day-to-day, but this is also the time of the year where school districts are planning for next year and really thinking about next year. And so, you know, all the questions of what should it look like next year? What is the new normal, and what do you keep from this year? What do you keep, and what are the new needs going to be for our students, right? We have lots of questions around, you know, what are families going to want come the fall? Are there some families who are going to say, we really want more online learning? This has worked really well for me or for my students. And what are our students going to need who are coming back, right? As they kind of readjust and recalibrate as to what their school experience is. So we're kind of in this both and of how do we continue the work for this year, and how do we plan and think for next year so that we can meet those needs.
Well, the advantage of going third is I get to hear the other two folks say what they're going to say and maybe just say ditto. We are in that weird space as well in the community college system of trying to figure out how do we end our spring semester, and we have summer classes as well. So we're thinking about summer and fall, and what does that look like? But the piece that I woke up thinking about today was it's one of the first days of registration for the fall semester for most of our institutions. And so we start looking at enrollment, and one of the big questions I have is who's going to show up. And I don't just mean how many students, I mean who. And hopefully I'll have an opportunity to talk a little bit more about some inequities that we've seen over the pandemic. But we've really seen a drop in the number of low-income first generation and students of color across our system, which are the primary students that we serve. And we're just greatly concerned about the widening gap in terms of access to higher education and in terms of success in higher education. So when I look at today's numbers and the numbers going forward and who's showing up, I'm really concerned about what we're going to see by the start of the fall semester. And where we're going to be. So in addition to thinking about how are we going to teach our courses, are they going to be remote? Are they going to be online? Are they going to be in person? All of those sorts of things we're planning for. But the big question in my head is who's going to show up, because we've seen a lot of people not show up in the last year. So.
Great. So I'm going to have to pick up on all of what you said there at the intro, all three of you. And we will get to there both from the inequities that we've experienced, some of the innovation in the future. But I actually want us to take that reflective look, right? Because we can't understand where we are without having some reflection and learning from the past and what we've lived through and what we've gone through, both good and bad. So, it has literally been a year of adaptation in so many ways for us individually, personally, in so many walks of lives, but definitely through the work that you all do. I want you all to maybe share with me what has been an example of where you think we have struggled through adapt, whether it's through the community college system or education system. And we'll take the positive side of this too, but I want to hear from you, where have we really struggled to adapt? And Landon, why don't I go reverse with you? Why don't I kick it off with you first?
Okay, so I will talk a little bit about instruction, and for us, there's a belief that we just moved to online. Well, we did not move to online. We moved to emergency response instruction, which is very different from online instruction. Online instruction is deliberately designed and delivered by instructors who are trained to teach online to students who want to take classes online. And we were in an environment where everyone had to move to some level of remote instruction. And we had instructors, our faculty, who 75% of them had never taught online or had any experience teaching in an online environment. And 75% of our students had no desire to take a remote online class. And so where we've struggled over the past year, and I think we've done well adapting to an emergency response instruction environment, but we have not, we are struggling with how much are our students learning? Are they meeting all of the outcomes for the courses? We're trying the best we can to make sure our faculty and instructors have the professional development they need in order to perhaps get a little better over the span of this year and providing the support for our students the best that we can. But I think that's the biggest struggle, is that we weren't really teaching online. We were really in an emergency response environment. And we had to bring people up to speed. We had to provide access to technology. We had to deal with a lot of outside issues that we typically wouldn't have had to deal with. So again, I think in some sense that's a success because we were able to do it. But in other sense, we're very concerned about what is the impact on student learning when we return to whatever normal looks like in the fall or whenever that is. And so that I think has been a struggle for us is the instructional side and ultimately the student learning side. And we feel like we've probably taken a hit in that area at our colleges.
So I think from the kind of K-12 side with in Aurora Public Schools, it's interesting a year ago when we extended our spring break. So we thought we'd be 2 weeks and then we'd be going back to normal. And then, as we all know, went over time and, really focused on providing access, but use that time, I think, to really enhance both last spring, the summer, and even at the start of the school year to really enhance our teachers' use of that technology, their professional learning to be able to teach online. And that has been incredible to see, teachers who have just embraced it and really, you hear from them all the time, we're not going back, right? Like, I'm going to use all this technology now moving forward. I think the challenge has come, right, is the ongoing engagement, right? We are seeing, we're continuing to see attendance and engagement challenges, right, with students, right? It is, whether they're not showing up or showing up for part of the time, like lots of choices kids have if they're remote and working and learning from home. And also just the challenge of, right, online learning requires a little bit more sometimes self-direction if they are doing asynchronous or kind of working on their own. And so there's a whole set of skills that, right, we maybe hadn't fully prepared our younger learners to be that self-directed as they're engaging in that online learning. And so I think that's a space where looking forward, I suspect we'll see more of that focus on those skills in order to support students as they grow up and as they move on and have more of that kind of self-direction and to support that engagement.
I'd offer sort of an out of the system addition to this, which is, I think, and there are wonderful exceptions to what I'm about to say, but I think in general, we saw pre-K through 12 fail to acknowledge the assets and capabilities of families. And so we have a tendency, sometimes at CEI, we call this fortress schools. We have a tendency to lean into this design and education that makes us feel like we have to do it all ourselves. And doesn't necessarily acknowledge that all kinds of families are capable of supporting some kind of learning experience for their children. And I spent the first half of my career teaching in and running schools that were 90% free and reduced lunch, 90% kids in poverty, largely immigrant. And I was reminded all the time that with the right scaffolding and support, parents of all kinds, of all demographics, can be the best possible support for their kids. And we didn't, I don't think, quickly enough pivot to recognize that. And we kept thinking about how do we deliver education to kids, as opposed to how do we tap into the assets of families and the other assets of communities that can be activated in this time. The older child response to that is thinking about what kids can do on their own when they're passionate and a little bit supported. We don't have great mechanisms in our system for recognizing the competencies, skills that kids gain when they take a job or when they pursue a passion on their own. And I think we're going to see, I hope we'll see changes in our system that both recognize the power of families and the possibility of older students to lead their own learning.
So picking up on that idea of families and just taking the flip side of this, right? Where did we knock it out of the park with, this massive change that happened to us, so many challenges, so many problems that we've witnessed, but I'm guessing we've seen, particularly now with a little bit of some hindsight behind us, where we really excelled during this past year. Rebecca, why don't you pick up from there, and then Christie and Landon, feel free to add on to anything else you want to share.
I do think my colleagues should probably answer this first because they're the folks who've been excelling, right? I mean, the nature of CEI means we're one arm's reach away from folks who are doing the hardest work. I think we've been reminded of the absolute heroism of many of our educators. We saw teachers figure out how to do all sorts of things, including, I talked to a teacher who said, I teach with 3 screens open because I know I have 2 kids who don't have childcare. And so I am the eyes and ears into that home. And so we saw schools and educators fill in gaps that they were never designed or trained to fill. And I can't say enough about what it's meant to watch teachers really rise to the occasion. We know our educators are really tired. The other thing we saw, and this seems basic now, you have to remember where we were a year ago. We saw school systems, Aurora, one of them, really pivot to fill in the gap around food access. And that alone was an operational lift that I think we've already forgotten about less than a year later, that I just have to say incredible things to Christie and her team and other district leaders across the state for figuring out how to do.
Thank you, Rebecca. That's work we're continuing, and I think that speaks to what Landon referenced earlier around some of the inequities. I think some of the places we knocked it out of the park were just really stepping up to address those, to make sure that all of our students and their families have regular access to food. So that's ongoing. We make sure that there are pickup at 30 some odd sites every day for families and for students and for parents to get breakfast, lunch, and kind of a supper snack. But also then we did not have a one-to-one computer strategy, right? And so literally within a month, probably even 3 weeks of going remote in the spring, distributed 20,000 laptops. I think now we have 30,000 laptops out to our students so that all of our students have that access, right? They all have that device to be able to, join. And, that way they're not having, if you have multiple kids in a household, they're able to all be learning online because they each have their own device to be able to access that online learning. And I think just, filling in those gaps to be able to make sure our students had access have been key, making sure we've been supporting families in connecting to internet access if they didn't have that internet access. And then I just have to echo what Rebecca said, which is our teachers have been, knocking it out of the park in just learning, taking, hundreds of courses over the summer or thousands of courses over the summer to learn entirely new platforms, right? And totally rethink how they teach with students online. And that has been just amazing to watch and watch our teachers really engage in. Always work to continue to do, but I think that is a really exciting place that'll lead us to great places in the future.
Tag on just a little bit to that. A couple things for community colleges. The technology piece was really an important aspect of our response as well. We have 40 locations across the state of Colorado and many in rural areas, and there's uneven access to broadband, for instance, or to cellular. So, what we turned, a lot of our rural colleges turned their parking lots into Wi-Fi receiving places. They flipped their Wi-Fi network external instead of internal, so that in those rural locations, students could still get access when they couldn't get on campus. In addition to, of course, distributing laptops and hotspots and webcams and all of those other things, not just to our students, but to our faculty and staff who may not have had that stuff as well. We've also, because of the nature of our programs, we have a lot of career and technical education programs that are hands-on learning. So really throughout the pandemic, from last summer on, we've continued to have some in-person instruction. And so balancing, having the lecture components, that type of learning was being done remotely, but we really got good at ensuring that we could still deliver some of the hands-on components. Think of like welding and auto and other sorts of programs that do require a physical presence, at figuring out our spaces and making sure people were the right distance apart and all of those other sorts of things. And the last thing I would mention, and this is somewhat counterintuitive to what I think is the narrative about remote learning, is I think there's been a real sense of humanness inserted into some of these classes. It seems odd to say that in a Zoom environment because we're looking at people and we're not physically in the same space. But if you think about all the Zoom or other types of virtual meetings you've been on, what do you see in the background? You see the person's room, you see their dog, you see their kids. As opposed to in a classroom, you just see the person and you don't necessarily know what's going on, or you don't know a lot about that person. I think one thing our faculty have really done is open themselves up to our students to let the students know a little bit more about themselves. And because they could see their students and their homes and those other sorts of things, they actually got to know their students better. So again, it seems a little counterintuitive to the Zoom environment where we think we're losing some social connection. And I think that's partially true, but I also feel like we're actually getting to know more about each other because you're seeing a little bit of a window into their life outside of the classroom. So I do think that's a really nice added piece to what we've been able to do, and I suspect in the K-12 world as well.
Anytime I see an animal come on a colleagues or someone that working with screen, I'm like, we gotta pause, acknowledge there's a cat walking behind you. Okay, well, we've got a lot of questions here and I want us to unpack this a little bit, and I promise folks we are going to get to that like visionary, what's everyone's plans for the future, but we have, and I'm going to maybe start with Christie and Rebecca on this because I want us to focus on the young ages here to start, and then Landon, we've got some about the youth transitioning into adulthood and community college school, but let's focus on the younger youth population. There's some chatter in the chat here, there, and some questions about widening gaps, right? And this is also builds into inequities when we talk about both racial ethnicity inequities, socioeconomic activities, but also ability. So in that younger population, there's a lot of concern about their ability of falling behind, and there's a lot of other things. Where are you seeing some of these big impacts on younger age children at really informative parts of them coming into the school system?
Yeah. So I think there's a few places where we're seeing this, and as I alluded to at the beginning, this is the forefront of the question for moving forward, right? How do we respond? I think where we're seeing the gaps are in a few spaces. One, in the academic space. I think the research out there and what we're seeing is in math, right? Which is harder to teach. Harder to teach from both, through this digital environment, but also just, right, that is a space where, there's lots of new ways to teach math. And so everything is learned differently, new strategies. I think the other space is in writing, because, if you think about or you imagine when you were a student in a classroom, you would have a teacher kind of walking around, looking at papers, right, like over your shoulder, giving you kind of real-time feedback. And that's a little harder to do when everybody's kind of typing or doing that writing on their own, and it speaks to that engagement piece. I think then the other big piece is on the social emotional side, right? The developing those young skills that especially our youngest learners need to be successful in school, right? Around how to interact, how to collaborate, how to develop how to socialize. We know that with, through play and things like that. And now, even when you're in person, some of that looks different because you're needing to keep that distance. And what is that? How does that look different too in the remote space?
We share some concern about that. As Christie alluded to, we're seeing early indications of some gaps in K-3 reading and 4th and 5th grade math. There are policy conditions in our state that mean we might overreact to the reading gap and underreact to the math gap. And the early conceptions of numeracy and math that students gain in the early years are very hard to make up. We just don't have good teaching strategies for figuring out how to fill those gaps later. The other thing is I worry that we risk over dialing on learning loss from an academic frame, as important as it is. To Christie's point, you may have a first grader who lost their kindergarten teacher with no notice and then went months without meeting their first grade teacher. And what that means, and maybe never met their peers. And this isn't necessarily social emotional learning in like the soft way we think about it. Well, that's just about wellness and families can make up for that. Those are critical to how young learners make meaning, learn about themselves, cognitively develop. We know the brain science about young learners through the age of 8. And we really have some work to do to make up for that. The other major issue that we're paying a lot of attention to in the early learning space is a potential bulge in kindergarten enrollment. So we know that that's where we had families red shirt kindergarten, maybe choose to not start. And what that means for next year is needing to be prepared for kindergarten classes and first grade classes that have a really wide array of cognitive readiness, physical size, think about a 5-year-old versus a 6-year-old, and social, emotional, and academic readiness, so that those early years are going to need to be more personalized and competency-based to meet the needs of varied ranges of student readiness for probably 2 to 3 years to come.
Thank you. And Landon, I mean, what about the community college? And if, people of all ages are in community college, what has been the impact to the student body? And I want to ask y'all too about, it's not just students. Students are a really important piece of this. There's so many people that make up, education of our society. But Landon, let's focus in a little bit on those that are enrolled, the academic admissions and the students. What are you seeing there as some of the biggest impacts?
Yeah. So first of all, for community colleges, we have such a wide range of age of students. It's a little different than what a person might think of as a traditional age student entering a university. As a freshman, sophomore, whatever. Our average age is around 25. And so we definitely have students who are 18 to 22, but we have a lot of students who are 45 years old who are doing a mid-career change. They're in construction and now they're trying to get a business degree or something like that. And so that's very much our student as well. And we also, just to tag a little bit on what Rebecca and Christie said in terms of academic readiness, we, given the wide range of students that we serve, We have a whole variety of students who come in with different readiness for college. We have some who come right out of high school who maybe just completed their math class, their senior math. We have others who haven't had math for 15 years. And so the way that we operate is we're very much come as you are, and we will work with whatever needs you have academically or in terms of student services. So I don't know that our philosophy will have to change too much because we serve of such a wide range. But in terms of what we've seen for students, the biggest thing on our side is what I started with is who's showing up. And you know, our typical student, again, not to stereotype or generalize, but a very typical student at a community college system is a mid-career professional, is an adult, they have children, they are working someplace, and often where they're working is in sectors that were hit hardest by the pandemic: hospitality, food service, other types of areas that might have been hit hard. And so what we're seeing, I think the biggest impact for us is that we're just not going to have students who, once they get their vaccine, are like, I'm going back to college. That's just not who our students are. They're going to have to write their personal ship before they can make a decision to come to college. They may have to find new employment. They may need to make sure that their family life is stable enough and their children are back in school or whatever. They may need transportation technology, food insecurity, housing support, other sorts of things that all need to be righted before they can say, I'm going to go back to college. And that's a very typical experience for a community college student, a little different from perhaps our vision of a university student. So how we react to that is we need to be able to adjust the services that we provide, have additional support on the financial side, both in terms of financial aid and in terms of scholarships that we can get through foundations, ramp up our food support, even some housing support, even for colleges who don't have residential life. So there's a number of things that we feel like we need to be able to ramp up outside of the classroom in order to support our students and help them as they eventually come back to us, whether it's this fall or next fall. And that's where our biggest challenge, I think, will be is how do we make sure that we can support our students outside of the classroom so that they can be successful inside the classroom.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Landon. You know, when we're thinking about the challenges and this disproportionate impact that the pandemic's having, we've been talking about it through the health side, through COVID side, science side, business side, impact side, right? It's definitely happening in our education system too, right? And it's very promising as someone who doesn't live and work and know much about the education world to hear, you know, I mean, this when you think about education, it is this full integration of how do you support people outside of just, it's not just here at the community college, it's not just here in the classroom, quote unquote, at public school, but it's that kind of whole person, whole lifestyle. I think that's, for someone who doesn't live and work in that environment, to me, understanding, right, that's how we have to think about people. That's how we have to think about children. That's how we have to think about society, right, is that whole. And there's not really, I didn't really have a strong question on that other than like, this is a really good conversation. I think we could spend a whole episode talking about how do we do that, particularly when we're trying to shift and focus on where we're seeing disproportionate impacts, right? And where's the most need given. Anything that anyone wants to add to that before I pivot off of talking about some of the inequities that we're seeing? I'll just kind of leave that open for a minute before I shift off that, because it's such an important topic. So I don't want to not give it enough airtime.
I think something though that Rebecca, you know, talked about from just the asset focused piece as well, right? That even though like, yes, there are areas we're focusing on in terms of learning loss or social development, I think we also have to remember that there are a lot of skills that our students and knowledge that our students gained throughout this pandemic and through this year, whether that's technology or just exploring new things that they were really interested in. And so part of this is also going to be about us figuring out how do we help students bring those assets and continue to develop them, and we build off them so that we're not just coming with this kind of deficit mindset.
The other very human piece of this, Kristen, is about trust. We saw places where, there's folks, futurists will tell you we have, as a society, waning trust in public institutions. We saw places where there was enormous trust in the school district or the school or the teacher, and that has been what has gotten people through. And we saw places where there was some unfortunate, really trust eroding behavior, particularly for families and kids of color who were also experiencing 2020's racial reckoning. And if you showed up in a classroom where nobody was prepared to talk to you about that or create space for that, we've seen families really start to question what that trusting relationship is. Do I trust that my teacher, who I love, is supported? Do I trust that my child will be seen and recognized and appreciated the same way as their peers? It's a hard thing to move people through, but I think it's been the human emotion that has made a difference one way or the other in how communities have responded and weathered this storm.
Landon, anything else before I shift the direction a little bit?
I'll let you shift.
Okay. I have a question here that is actually somewhat semi-related, but is a little bit of a shift. And then we're going to move into kind of those major transformational innovations we've seen. So Rebecca, I actually want you to maybe speak to this because when we were talking earlier in advance, right, the role of families and the voice of families. And one of our guests, Anna, was curious about how does the voice of family, how is that being included in major decisions when it comes to returning to school, when it comes to the education of their children?
So, I think, and Christie, I'd be curious if you agree with me on this, that this is one of the biggest sea changes we saw that will have lasting impact in education, is that the power balance between families and young people and schools really shifted. All of a sudden, families and young people had a whole lot of choice about how they showed up and whether they showed up and what they chose. And I saw a question in the chat about enrollment in full-time private online schools or district, the online schools that have existed for a long time. We know that enrollment went up statewide by about 40%. Families exercised choice in all kinds of ways that they might not have before. And in some ways, the system wasn't built to respond very well to that. We saw schools put out discipline policies that said silly things like all remote learners must wear shoes. Well, no one actually cares if your kid is wearing shoes. That's just this sort of system, this response that's built into our systems to try to exercise control. And I think if anybody wanted to study one thing, and at least in the K-12 sector over the next year or two, it will be fascinating to watch how this balance is renegotiated. We know that, Christie alluded to this, possibly as many as 15% of families in large systems are going to say, there's something about a remote or a hybrid experience that we want, and we're not willing to say our choices are only 100% online or 100% bricks and mortar. And we have a set of policy conditions in Colorado that allow families to really lead with where they put their time. And it's, I think, going to be incumbent on our sector to figure out how to respond to that.
I think Rebecca's right. I do think this is both a place where we've seen change and will continue to see change. Because if you think about, and in Aurora, we were primarily remote for most of the fall and obviously last spring. And so what suddenly changed was, it used to be, okay, once the student comes to my classroom or shows up in school, right, then it's between the teacher and the student, right, the learning, and then the parent may be brought in. Now it's really a triangulation, right, because the parent may be in the class if the student is remote, or the parent is the conduit for helping make sure the student is set up, right, and is accessing what they need to for the remote learning. And so it really became kind of this collaboration. And I think that this is a space where our teachers have flexed and adjusted, and there's still an opportunity to really continue to strengthen that. I know for us in Aurora, we have about 160 different languages spoken with our families. And so we had to really pivot and think about, how do you strengthen that communication? And so how do you have more of that you know, we now have an app that we use to be able to allow teachers and parents to communicate back and forth in, you know, in over 100 different languages. That's going to really support. And I suspect we'll see that continue because that creates that direct communication. I think as we go ahead, you know, one of the things as we think about next year is really hearing from our families and parents, what does your student want? As Rebecca alluded to, what is the kind of experience they're looking for? And what are they seeing at home that their student needs, right? So that we can be prepared when students come back in the fall to be able to respond to that. Because as Rebecca said, they have insight that we may not necessarily have if a student's been remote the entire year.
Thank you. So let's talk about, oh, sorry, always a little feedback there. Let's talk about the fall. Let's talk about the future. I'm going to take Landon's word, you know, what's going to stick when we were talking. So what's innovation otherwise, right? It doesn't have to be technology. It can be anything that you've seen. What is transformational? What's been good? And what is here to stay? And Landon, why don't you kick this off? And I want all three of you to provide something to this conversation.
Yeah, actually, I like this question a lot because we're at that point now where we're thinking about that as opposed to just how do we continue to respond to the pandemic. And so a couple of things, and they do build off of what Rebecca and Christie said. One is in the area of instruction. You know, this idea that it's either 100% on campus in person or 100% online. We really have found this a different modality of instruction, what we're calling high flex. It's kind of like a hybrid, but a little bit different. So in any given week, a student could connect to a class live like this, like we are right now, or they could attend the class in person, or if they have something happening in their lives, they could hear the recorded lecture and other sorts of things outside of that normal class period. So, and again, 1 week at one day, this week could be you're going to attend in person, and next week you're going to attend online. So that real flexibility is something that we've really expanded in our environment, and think that that's going to stick around. It might not be every single class, but we really think that provides the support and the choice for students for what works best for them given their busy lifestyles. The second is just student support. If I think about academic advising or mental health counseling, for instance, prior to the pandemic, pretty much if you wanted to speak to an advisor or you wanted to speak to a counselor, you had to come to campus physically at a specific set time and date. Now with this technology, it is enabled by technology. And not that the technology didn't exist before, it's that people have become comfortable with it. So now we believe we'll be able to provide student support and reach more students who maybe couldn't come to the campus and actually have one of those advising or counseling appointments. And the last thing I would say just real quickly is I really feel like we've learned or become more empathetic in the past year. We have understood, and for our community college faculty, really understood that students do have outside barriers and issues that do impact their ability to be present or successful in the classroom. And perhaps there was a mindset before that, well, those don't matter. That's outside the classroom. You either get here and do your work or you fail the class. And I think there's just this different understanding that people have a whole bunch of other sorts of things that they bring to the table, both positive and negative, that impact their ability to be successful. And I think we've grown more empathetic to and understanding that happens. And so I like to believe that that will carry forward past the pandemic. And that greater understanding and trust amongst the instructor and the student will continue even when the pandemic ends.
Rebecca, why don't you take that, and then Christie, you can wrap up with that thought too.
I'll be quick just to manage our time. We've talked a lot about younger learners. I want to say a few things about high school. I think we've had many families and high school students realize that the way we've constructed the American high school, where there's very little opportunity for specialization, students are sort of locked in to what we call seat time in terms of how they progress through classes. And we have grading policies, and that I was guilty of this myself 20 years ago, but grading policies that don't honor whether or not a student has mastered the material, but instead honor all sorts of things that teachers, designed a long time ago and haven't interrogated. I think, and particularly what we know about this generation of young people, we'll see a lot of change to how young people demand some kind of personalization, demand more personalized pathways to a high school degree, and demand hybrid experiences that leverage what Landon does and what universities do to close some of the silos between high school work and higher ed.
I would echo everything Landon and Rebecca said, and I think you'll see this, even though we've been in this digital space, and you'll see that continue. I think there will be that increased emphasis on relationships. I think, we know that that is such an impactful piece of student success in school. And I think we've realized that those relationships are even more critical and more important throughout this time, whatever those relationships are, whether they're teachers or family or community members.
Thank you. That was you all provided actually a really nice, I think, ending to this thing. And yes, everything that you all said, and I can't agree with you more how important relationships are at all walks of life. And I think the pandemic has highlighted the value and importance of that human connection that we were talking about. This was a joy of a conversation. I learned a ton. Thank you all so much for what you do. Thank you for giving us the time this morning. It has been a great pleasure having you today and getting to meet and talk with you a little bit more about this huge, huge topic. I think we hit on a lot of good areas. So thank you for joining me today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Kristen.
Thank you.
Great. And thank you to our audience. As people notice, we did not have a university person on here. 45 minutes goes fast, even with this wonderful, diverse group of experiences that we have. So we did our best. We didn't cover everything, but I really enjoyed this conversation. Hopefully you did too. Thank you for joining us today. As a friendly reminder, we'll be back in 2 weeks on March 24th. We're going to be talking about the future of business and culture. We'll have Mayor Hancock joining us, Ed Seelover from the Denver Business Journal, and Deborah Jordy from the SCFD District, Scientific and Cultural Facilities District, joining us in 2 weeks. So back here Wednesday, March 24th at 8:30. I wish you all to stay well, stay healthy, stay safe, and hopefully you find some joy in your day-to-day life today. Thank you all and take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.